Hello, U.S. history class. Here we stand to talk about the next section of America emerging, this modern America. And this is jumping way away from our domestic ambitions and the changes that happen in the United States and looking at American imperialism, which is the swelling of America to beyond our borders. So in this, we need to answer two essential questions, and these questions are on your notes. You need to come up with an answer for these things. And the first one is this: why does the United States abandon our traditional policies of isolation? Remember, all the way back to George Washington, avoid foreign entanglements. Don't get twisted up with other countries. It's going to lead to some serious problems. So why all of a sudden in the end of the 19th century, in the 1890s, do we just go and just throw this away and immerse ourselves in the world? Secondly, how and where does the United States expand its global influence? Well, we're going to take a few minutes and answer these questions. So here you see President McKinley, and he is down here outfitting Uncle Sam for a bigger suit because we're about to grow American imperialism. Okay? So to answer these questions about the United States, we kind of need to look at the world because, America is, with all this industrialization and at the end of the Civil War, et cetera, we're emerging as this kind of a global economic power. And so what's going on in the world is the entire world is being carved up by Europe. Asia and Africa had been divided into colonies all over the place for, places for people to move, but also just for resources. I mean, India, it's just the whole world is being taken over. That's imperialism. And you know what? It is societies that have large, powerful states and industrialization that are exploiting and stealing from nations that had not had large-scale industrialization. That's basically it. Okay? So America looks at this and maybe if we're going to jump into this game, maybe we're behind on it. Now, I'm not advocating for this type of imperialism at all, but I'm saying that this is what compelled the United States. So what was going on with us? Well, remember Manifest Destiny? America had not really done much thinking about the rest of the world because we had concentrated on Western expansion. But now that the Western frontier is closed, and it is closed, we don't have anywhere else to go. So if we have an economic system that is built on continuously expanding, and we do, America would now have to leave our shores and reach out beyond our nation. That is going to be imperialism. So if you look here is the last railroad tie being laid on the Transcontinental Railroad. And the West is done, it's all carved up. It's all carved up. So now what? And people begin looking outward. Okay. So that leads to imperialism. And we need to know this as a working definition. So make sure you go into your definitions and put this down. Imperialism. It is expansion where a foreign land is claimed as a territory or colony by another country. Now, this is good old-fashioned imperialism. There's also military imperialism, where you don't actually take the country over. You just station your military there so that you can control what they do. There's economic imperialism, where you use your wealth to cripple somebody else's, economy until they obey sort of what your nation wants them to do, and then you let those restrictions up. There's all types of things. Because imperial comes from the word emperor. It means you're ruling over somebody else. So why are we going to get involved with this game? It doesn't seem to jibe much with our whole freedom, liberty, all men created equal thing. Okay? Well, a big part of it is, how powerful and wealthy and controlling the American industrialists that came up in this time were. And so American industrialists, these Rockefellers, these Carnegies, these men that we had talked about, lobbied the government to adopt specific policies that would open new foreign markets up for them. Remember, they lobbied the government to open up policies like the Dawes Act so they could get land away from Native Americans. And, they had this controlling interest. That's how powerful they were and what a grip they had on the White House. Go ahead. Try to name me some of the presidents in the United States that exist in the late 19th century. You know what? It's kind of hard to do because there weren't a whole lot of superstars coming out in that time period. All right. Think about it. We had Lincoln, and then we had, Grant, and Johnson was a bad guy. Gosh, who comes after them? Exactly. Okay. But we all have heard of the name Rockefeller. Yeah, that's a big thing. All right. So where do we start thinking about expansion? Well, the Mexican-American War showed us that Mexico was off limits. And then Canada was off limits because of the War of 1812. But, Russia owned Alaska, and they were willing to sell it. And so Secretary of State J. Seward, all right, purchased Alaska, and he only paid $7 million for it from Russia. So you ever wonder where we get Alaska from, which is kind of disconnected from the United States? This is it. We bought it. People called it Seward's folly. They made fun of him. They said, this is such a terrible idea. It's this big frozen chunk of ice. Nobody will ever be interested in it. Oh my gosh. It almost doubled America's territory. Look at this map. Look at how much land is in Alaska. And now Alaska is connected into the global web of trade. It's full of oil and timber and gold and natural resources. It is a fight between Alaska and the Louisiana Purchase as to what was the greatest real estate deal of all time. But that is the beginning of us expanding our territory outside of the actual borders of what is now the United States, the purchase of Alaska. We also started making inroads into foreign countries. Now, look, some of this is kind of offensive and racist, and that's mostly because some of this part is kind of offensive and racist. It just was, okay? So some of the ways that we're reaching out into other places and softening up the arrival of, American culture and business and that kind of stuff is through religion, all right? Missionaries are going to start heading out into foreign countries to spread Western culture by spreading Christianity, with the idea that, if we can make the cultures in foreign countries be a little more like us, then it'll be a little easier for us to get there and sell them things. I love this quote from the Archbishop Desmond Tutu from Africa. He says, when the missionaries came to Africa, they had the Bible and we had the land. They said, let us pray. We closed our eyes, and when we opened them, we had the Bible, but they had the land. Okay? So why did it seem like it was okay to do this? Here you see these people that are missionaries that are there to, convert people and spread the word of God. They're riding on the back of these Asian men, treating them like horses or cattle. The reason is there was some bad science going on in this time period that is called social Darwinism. All right. There's, this idea after Darwin's theory of evolution that you could apply it to the human race, to society, and to politics. And they created this hierarchy in races that said the Caucasian, who are called the Caucasoid, was on the top. And underneath came all of these other races, the Mongoloid, the Native American, the Aboriginoid, people from Africa and of African descent. And they created this racial hierarchy, talking about that God had made certain men in his image. Well, that must be, the white people. Yeah, that's not to say that, the white Jesus picture that everybody has at home is wrong, but it's probably not right. So this was applied in the interest of economics and in the interest of American expansion, and it made it sort of okay in people's minds to begin exploiting, foreign countries for resources and land and that type of stuff. Okay. By the way, this is going to come back in America and with a horrible practice that we'll learn about a little later in the class that is called eugenics, and is sort of some things that come out of some of the Nazi beliefs about pure bloodlines and all types of stuff. In the end, people had adopted this belief that's called the white man's burden. All right. It basically is related to the patriarchy that we learned about with slavery, where people argued that slavery was okay because, obviously Africans weren't civilized, and, life here in America as a slave would be better than life without, Christianity and Western culture and English language and stuff back in Africa. Okay. This idea, as it's applied in the late 19th century, is called the white man's burden. It comes from Rudyard Kipling, really racist guy. Also wrote Jungle Book, for those of you who are interested in old cartoons. All right. The white man's burden says that it is the duty of the civilized white man to lift up lesser people. And you can read that as Tanner people because that's how it was applied. It's people that were thought of as savages. And you lift these people up with education, with religion, and with civilization. I mean, we see that now. Every time we look at any other culture or civilization or race, we always wonder why they don't have our values. Okay. And we judge them for not having our values. They probably judge us for not having theirs, right? And so here you see in this cartoon, here is a depiction of the United States. And by the way, that looks a lot like coming president Teddy Roosevelt, who's really into all of this imperialism stuff. And he has picked this, and not my words, their words, he's picked this savage up onto his shoulder and he's carrying him up the hill through much struggle. It's his burden to take him to the schoolhouse and to bring him civilization. In the end, these types of justifications about racial hierarchy and civilizing the savage world and higher races and lesser races, these were used as justifications to go steal land in foreign territories for America's benefit. Okay? Where is a prominent example of this? Well, we will find it in Hawaii. All right? Hawaii is a place that had agreements with America and other places for us to go there, to dock ships, to trade, etc. This is Queen Liliuokalani that's up here. She was the last queen of the Hawaiian people, a very, regal and respected and refined woman. But you will see how she is pictured in American cartoons, very different than in reality. And in American cartoons, they have the fact that she is propped up and protected by our soldiers, that she wouldn't even be able to have this. Somebody else would have already taken her over. Well, if somebody's going to take her over, it might as well be the United States. And American businesses are going to reach out and lobby the United States government to overthrow the Queen of Hawaii. All right? And you will not have to spell her name, so don't freak out. But it's Liliuokalani, if you want to say it. Hawaii, as an island nation that was formerly independent, was claimed by the United States because, yes, Dole pineapple had a whole lot to do with us stealing these poor people's country. So we claimed it for the pineapple growth, the sugar production. But what the government of the United States really wanted it for was a Pacific refueling station. Because as we expand out of the United States, we are now expanding a Navy presence. Check it out. Hawaii, when you sail from California to Hawaii and you get fuel, you then can sail to Asia and make it back. You can make it from Asia to the United States, but you can't make it back. You got to have a refueling place, right? You ever wonder why the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor in Hawaii in World War II? It's because they wanted it as a base so they could fly their planes from Hawaii and attack California and make it back to their Hawaiian bases. That's the same reason we wanted Hawaii. It was strategy. None of our strategy of creating a powerful force in the Pacific factored in the fact that Hawaii belonged to the Hawaiians. And now it's a state in the United States. Why was it so important for us to have these refueling stations? Why was it so important for us to expand our Navy? A lot of it comes from a book. This book is written by a man named Alfred T. Mahan. It is called The Influence of Sea Power on History. It basically argues that no country has ever become dominant or powerful if they didn't have a navy. So the two ideas that are really just crushing in on American policy at this time are born out of this book. It says that countries can't thrive without a powerful navy to protect its trade. Kind of makes sense. And that we have to have Pacific territories so that we can maintain that navy. Well, that makes sense if we have a lot of opportunity to trade in Asia, which is going to be the next place we start turning our attention. So if you look at this map on the bottom, which I will also find a way to share with you, okay, because some of these things are really going to matter in history, like the Philippines and Midway and Hawaii. All of these islands that are down here, Samoa, etc., these all become protectorates or possessions of the United States over about a 40 or 50 year period. We start claiming all these territories so that we have places that we can dock our ships, refuel them, land planes, etc. And a lot of these are going to become significant locations of battles in World War II, in the battle for the Pacific against the Japanese Navy. So it's not like we mention this stuff and it's gone. We mention this stuff and it will come back. Okay. There's also the issue of how long it takes for us to sail from California all the way around South America and to the East Coast of the United States. And so people begin to advocate the building of a canal that connects the Atlantic and Pacific Ocean. There's a couple of places that make sense for that to happen, but Roosevelt will actually do it. And he's going to do it in a place called Panama. And this is a picture of the Panama Canal. I just want you to understand that this is also us going into a foreign country and eventually kind of getting in our way by a show of force, okay? So we'll come back to this, but understand that this is an important point that fits into this particular narrative. But when we talk about Teddy Roosevelt, we'll expand on this a little bit more, okay? So how are we going to, get involved in these areas of the world? Like, what would be our justification for it? In America that thrives off of philosophical values of freedom and people's rights, can't just sail out and take over places in the world. And so then, much like now, journalism and news is going to have a role in getting us into wars. Remember, wars don't start with guns. They start with words and pens. And the journalism at that time that will promote us into getting involved in these types of conflicts is called yellow journalism. And this is not the only time that journalism comes up in this time period with significance, okay? Because just like this journalism is going to turn us towards imperialism, another type of journalism is going to expose the problems that exist inside cities and inside factories, that an investigative journalism. Yellow journalism is sensationalized news stories that promote extreme patriotism to less educated people. And we have poor journalism now. You go home, you sit on the channel, you turn on the news, and it says, "Warning, your child may be wearing this jacket, and it is flammable." And you go, "Oh my gosh, I'm so scared." Well, if somebody is afraid, okay, they can be directed to act. And there are two men at this time. One guy's name is Joseph Pulitzer. And yes, that's who the Pulitzer Prize is named after. The other person's name is William Randolph Hearst. They are newspaper publishers, and they promote this type of sensational journalism. And they start finding that there's a certain group of maybe less educated reader that can be aimed at certain political goals by promoting patriotism. But it is a special type of patriotism. It is a eagle screaming, America is the greatest, always distrust the foreigner, speak English in our country type of patriotism. It's called jingoism. It is an extreme nationalism that often supports foreign wars. And it plays on a real fear of foreigners. Like, the idea that, you don't trust people if they're from foreign country. Maybe they're spies, maybe they're enemies, maybe they hate America, maybe they hate our freedoms. We've all heard these types of things come out in our modern political discourse. Well, it's not new. This stuff is old. It's been around for, forever, going back through the history of our country. But in this period of time, it's going to get us involved in a war that's going to kind of change the course of our country. Okay. So there is, just like America had proclaimed its independence in 1776 from Britain, Spain still owns colonies. And one of those colonies is Cuba. And there is a lot of tension and fighting and conflict between the people of Cuba and the people of Spain. Now, look, we don't want Spain in our backyard anyway. We don't want competition from other European countries, right? And so America at this time, we're trying to spread our wings out, if you will, and expand our influence, is going to sail a battleship called the USS Maine down to the harbor of Havana, Cuba. That's the capital of Cuba, and park it there. Okay, we're just going to park it there and try to say, like, hey, remember, we're right here. Remember that Monroe Doctrine, like, you stay in Europe, we'll stay in America. We're just going to kind of maintain order in our backyard. Well, one morning, everybody wakes up and the USS Maine had exploded. 266 sailors are dead, all right, at the USS Maine. It is called an attack on America. All of a sudden, these yellow journalists, these sensationalized newspapers say, Spain attacked America, blew up the ship, killed American sailors. We have to go to war right now. And you see this cartoon that is printed down here in the corner, and they have Spain pictured as this snarling, ravenous beast leaning on a tombstone for the Maine soldiers. And just in case you really can't get the point, it says murdered by Spain, and it becomes a battle cry. Remember the Maine and to hell with Spain. Remember, everybody's yelling, go to war, go to war. Well, guess what? They got the war. They got the war through this journalism. Now, look, it turns out after a long investigation that the powder room that they kept the gunpowder in had a fire and exploded in the bottom of Maine. It wasn't actually an attack at all. But look at the headline down here. Destruction of the warship Maine was the work of an enemy. The war had already happened. So accident or not, here we are, right? And it will lead to the Spanish-American War. Now, look, I'd love to talk about this a whole lot. It was called that Splendid Little War, right? Splendid Little War of 1898. Well, we're not going to really talk about it. Spanish forces are defeated in both the Atlantic and Pacific Ocean. We sail around the world. We defeat Spain. Spain is tottering at this point as a European power anyway. And as a result, we are going to claim land. American imperialism. The United States is going to take Puerto Rico away from Spain. 1898. Guess what? Puerto Rico, still a property of the United States, and very likely will end up eventually being the 51st state of the United States. We don't take Cuba because that would look bad in the papers, since we went down there to try to support them, saying they want to be free. If we take them over and claim them for our own, that'd be kind of tacky, I guess. And so we just say, hey, we're not going to take Cuba, but we'll maintain the right to regulate Cuba, which is a weird way of saying, like, you need to do what we want, otherwise we're going to step in and do something about it. So that's kind of that military imperialism I talked about earlier. But Puerto Rico, that's American territory, okay? Now, what America does do in Puerto Rico is we're going to claim a place called Guantanamo Bay. And we're going to say, hey, guess what? Down in this territory, to make sure that we can maintain order, we're going to keep this naval base at Guantanamo Bay. And we'll operate out of there. Now, you've probably heard of Guantanamo Bay because now that's where America has a military prison We still maintain it and control it, and it's where we lock up terrorists that have been captured in other countries. So it is still a secret military prison controlled by the government of the United States. Okay? Who knew it came out of the War of 1898? Now, just like Andrew Jackson at the end of the War of 1812 won the Battle of New Orleans and becomes this big national hero, out of nowhere, America in the Spanish-American War is going to get a new national hero. It's a guy named Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt starts this cavalry unit up that he calls the Rough Riders. They're supposed to be this rugged picture of American individuals, it's college students and dentists, but it's also, cowboys and football players and ex-prisoners and just these tough men, these tough, manly men. And he will lead them in a charge up San Juan Hill against Spanish forces and, conquer the Spanish and help capture it. There's a lot of hero creation in the story about the Rough Riders and that kind of, like, they didn't even get to ride their horses in this battle. They had to leave them because the ground was too rough. But whatever, he comes out an American hero. And let me tell you probably don't know much about Teddy Roosevelt. He's going to eventually become a great president of the United States. And he will catapult onto the national scene because of this military victory. So please pay note to Teddy Roosevelt, because he is going to be a person that greatly shapes the direction of the United States during the era that we're learning about, okay? Teddy Roosevelt and his Rough Riders. Here, you want to hear a quick story? All of you have probably had a teddy bear. So the story about Teddy Roosevelt, he's a big hunter. He wanted to kill a bear. So he took a gun and he couldn't find a bear. So eventually the guy who's guiding him on the hunt says, "Hey, I'll get a bear for you." And he goes out and the man has tied like a little baby bear to a fence. And he's like, "Go ahead, Teddy, shoot the bear so you can say you killed your bear." And Teddy Roosevelt refuses and lets the bear go. People are so taken by this story and the soft heart of Teddy Roosevelt, they start producing fake bears for children to sleep in, and they call them teddy bears. Oh, look at that. Okay. Now, because America won in both the Atlantic, Cuba, and the Pacific, the United States will also claim the island nation of the Philippines. I so am heartbroken by not being able to teach deeper about the campaign and really betrayal of America from the forces in the Philippines that were fighting to also free themselves from being controlled by another country. It is truly one of the darker periods in American history, in my opinion. Anywhere from 50,000 to maybe 1 million Filipinos were killed by American forces there after we had promised them to help liberate them. But we didn't liberate them. We took them over. And America is now an imperial force. And you see the shadow of America leaving out of these United States and stretching all the way across the Pacific. It's an American empire being built across the Pacific Ocean. All right? Now that we are across the Pacific, we get to the root of the motivation, which is the fact that we want to be able to get into these Asian markets. And it's why the industrialists of the time had pushed the government of the United States towards so many policies that favored us getting there. So you look down here at the bottom at these spheres of influence. Here are all these, European and Japan also countries that were claiming, these areas of influence where they could get in and, work in these opening markets in China. China had this enormous population that is just starting to step into modernization in this time period. And so the Secretary of State at the time, a man named John Hay, will negotiate and issue something called the Open Door Policy. The Open Door Policy says that all nations should have equal and fair access to Chinese market. But they also have to follow the laws of China. Just because we're going to force our way into your markets and make sure that we can undercut whatever you produce in your own country and force you to allow us to create, sell, and manufacture things for all your people doesn't mean that we're not going to follow your laws. But what it really is to say that at the threat of standing up for ourselves with the military, the United States will enter into this market no matter who was there previously, because now we have access to it by way of this chain of Pacific islands that we have claimed to be our territories, from Hawaii to the Philippines. Okay? And so, is there an incredible amount of hypocrisy in this policy? Absolutely. Here's the open door policy, where Uncle Sam, which always represents the United States, is prying the door open and using the army, that's what that block says, to hold the door open so that we can enter into China no matter what anybody says. But here in America, as soon as the Chinese were done working as almost slave labor, laying the transcontinental railroad from the Pacific Ocean to the middle of our country, as soon as that last tie was laid down, we passed the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, basically saying we don't want Chinese people to live in the United States, but we sure want to come into China and sell our products to the Chinese people. And so when we hear these modern debates about manufacturing and trade and relationships with China when it comes to economics, think about the historical origins of this kind of conflict and this conversation that go back almost 150 years. Okay? America now has a Pacific economic empire, from America to Puerto Rico to Alaska, through the Hawaiian Islands, through all of these different places, all the way to the Philippines, where the open door policy will allow us entrance into Asian markets. This is American imperialism. Okay? What about other continents and other areas? Because we have right to the south of us all of these places that had so long been under Spanish influence, but now the Spanish government and the Spanish nation has kind of been rocked back on its knees, because going all the way back to the Monroe policy, we had said that we're not going to interfere in the governments of South America or colonize in those areas. A different plan is going to arise. We're not going to go down and try to take over, places in, Colombia and Brazil and, that type of thing. We're going to use a different type of imperialism. We're going to call this dollar diplomacy. This is literally the only thing in class that you really need to know about President William Howard Taft. He is going to open up Latin American markets to American businesses. And how he does that is this. He promises businesses in the United States that if they invest in Latin American nations, that the United States will use force, our military, to protect that expansion of businesses. All right? That means that Central and South America will be open for business for the United States, to grow our economy, to make our economic system more powerful and more wealthy, and that the government and the military of the United States will back up private business, through force. And if you look here, all of these little explosions that you see here in the Caribbean Ocean area, this is where the military of the United States will go into these places to fight, in the interest of stabilizing economic relationships with those countries. And that's not new. We still do that type of thing. This is a different form of imperial control. And so, through this time period, probably the most famous cartoon here, you will see the United States that has attempted to expand all over the world, and all of the different and various places that we have forced to sit in front of us, that we have forced some measure of control over. And you could look at this cartoon forever and see the Native Americans that are being kept away from everybody else. You see the small Chinese student that is being kept outside the door by the Exclusion Act. You see the African American in the back that is being forced to do labor but not being put in the classroom. And here, seated in front of us, through that weird idea, that racist idea of the white man's burden, the Philippines, Hawaii, Puerto Rico, and Cuba being forced to come to the table under the control of the United States. This is imperialist America, and it's how we start to exert our authority around the globe. Thank you so much for your attention, and I will see you at our next class.